In episode 5 of Chrontendo, we chronicled what was definitely a very exciting time for Nintendo, the release of Super Mario Bros. And the NES in the United States. Unfortunately, episode 6 is not going to see anything as spectacular. In fact, some of the very worst games for the Famicom are going to be released right around this time. On the plus side, we're going to see a game that's highly influential in Japan, though not very well known in the US, and we're also going to take a look at a game that's rather misunderstood. 1985 would have the third holiday season for the Famicom, so Nintendo was putting out games for the Famicom at a frantic pace. There were actually 17 games released in December of 1985, far more than any month we've seen previously. Alright kids, first up this episode is BurgerTime. This is a port of Data East's 1982 hit arcade game. And oh my, just dig that crazy music. Some video game music walks the fine line between annoying and catchy, and that is the perfect way to describe this music. While playing this game, I kind of hate this music, but damn if it doesn't put me in the mood to run around stomping on hamburgers. So for those not familiar with this game, you are Peter Pepper, a chef trying to construct some giant hamburgers here, and the only ingredients in your kitchen are trying to kill you. You have some sausages and some eggs chasing after you. Your only defense is you can sprinkle some pepper on them. That'll temporarily blind them, I guess. And of course you can also crush them with the hamburger buns and the lettuce and the meat. If you walk on them, it drops on top of them, it will kill them and they'll rematerialize a second later, as you saw there a second ago. Sometimes their rematerialization is not to your advantage. Now this game was released by Namco for the Famicom in Japan. I think it was actually developed by Data East. When this came out in the US, and it did eventually come out for the NES in the United States, it was released by Data East themselves. And this is a pretty accurate port. I believe there was a not so good version of this for the 2600, probably other consoles as well. I don't actually recall, but I'm sure this is the best version for home consoles. The controls are actually a little sticky at times. Sometimes I have a hard time getting onto the ladders, but it's a pretty good port. And here we have a game that you probably haven't heard of, the Japanese-only Ikki. We have the rousing and rather long little introduction music there. Well, Ikki means revolt, and what it's referring to is a time in medieval Japan when farmers and peasants were sort of fed up of their samurai overlords and started doing little revolts. It was actually apparently pretty common for a little while, and that's what this game is about. You are a farmer. You have what appears to be a scythe, which you throw at the ninjas that are being sent to quell the revolt. How exactly are you revolting other than by killing ninjas? Well, you're grabbing a lot of gold coins, first of all. Not really sure why the gold coins are just laying around in the fields, but the object is to pick up each of the gold coins found in each level, and then you move on to the next level. This is actually a port of a Datasoft arcade game from 1985, and this actually looks pretty good. It controls kind of weird. Your weapon sort of like automatically hones onto the nearest enemy, and the enemy's weapons sort of do the same to you. One thing that's a little odd is that the enemies sort of appear out of nowhere, especially around the top of the screen, so it's pretty easy to get killed. I mean, you'll be walking around, suddenly bam, there's a ninja with a star being thrown right at you. And there's also other enemies, like these little demons come out that sort of paralyze you. There's some guys actually shooting at you there. So it's not a terribly interesting little game. It's not terrible. It's sort of amusing to play for a little while. I guess one of the most interesting things about this is that it takes place in medieval Japan, which we haven't really seen a whole lot of video games do this. Of course, later this become a big subject for Japanese video games. Both games taking place in feudal Japan as well as medieval China as well. Think of all those Three Kingdoms games that come out. So it's interesting that Japanese developers were starting to think of new subject matter for video games around this time. That and the fact this game uses a lot of vertical and horizontal scrolling make it kind of unique for the time period. The scrolling is certainly much better than Challenger. So this is certainly the most interesting game we'll be seeing in today's episode. Certainly starts out with an unusual and almost startling beginning. The sound of a police siren getting louder and louder. Then the title appears. Don't know if there's ever been an NES intro quite like this one. Now this game was only released in Japan, but there was an unofficial English translation, so we'll actually be taking a look at that so we can understand what's going on in this game. The name of this game is Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken, but in English we call it the Portopia Serial Murder Case. And if this game certainly doesn't look like anything else that's been released on the Famicom so far, that's because it really is the first adventure game released for the Famicom. This genre would become quite popular in Japan. As far as I know, this is almost certainly the first Japanese adventure game, or at least the first popular Japanese adventure game. Its influence in Japan is, quite enormous. The adventure game has been around since the earliest days of computer gaming. It was actually a pretty popular genre in the early to mid-80s in the United States. But in Japan it really took a life of its own, mostly thanks to this game. Later we'll see a lot of games that pretty much copy this directly, and later different genres would sort of branch off, like the visual novel and the various Japanese porno games that still exist to this day. So this game virtually single-handedly created a new genre in Japan. How you actually play this game is you use your D-pad to navigate around the menu. The little square with the graphic is what you're looking at this moment. You can use a magnifying glass to get a closer look at things. You'll often find hidden objects. Of course, this is necessary to actually really get through the game. You can look for clues, pick up clues, find out information about various suspects and other people involved, ask people questions, go to the police headquarters, call in suspects and question them. If you perform the right actions, eventually people will usually give you some more information. For example, you actually have to hit this guy with a little hammer in order to get him to confess. Turns out he's not the murderer, he's just a drug dealer. There are numerous red herrings that pop up throughout this game. And of course, there's also an interesting sense of humor that appears throughout this game. For example, if you hit Yasu in the head with a hammer, he'll make funny little comments. Let's talk a little bit about the history of this game. It was originally released for Japanese NEC computers back in 1983. The game was originally designed by Chunsoft, who, as you might recall from earlier, consists of Yuji Horii, but also Koichi Nakamura. Previously, Chunsoft had released Door, which was by Enix. This is also by Enix. It's the second Enix game for the Famicom. The original computer version actually had you using the keyboard to type in commands. Obviously for the Famicom port this wasn't possible, so they used the arrow and button control scheme. This became quite popular, and later Japanese adventure games would all use this. Even nowadays, adventure games and porno games for the Japanese computers have you use the arrows to scroll around rather than actually typing in commands. This Famicom version would prove quite popular, apparently selling around 700,000 copies in Japan, so it was a pretty substantial hit. Chunsoft's next game after this would be Dragon Quest, which would be an even huger hit. Reportedly, while in the United States, Hori played the early US RPG Wizardry, which contains a lot of first-person scrolling around mazes. This inspired him to put a maze in this game. It's actually later on in the game. We'll see a little bit of it later. This is actually the part of the game where most players find it pretty frustrating because you sort of have to find your way through a first-person maze with no map. Now, of course, if you actually go ahead and play this game in the English translation, you'll probably want to take notes. There's actually quite a few things to remember. The game is sort of a puzzle game. You sort of have to logically figure things out. However, one criticism you might have about this game, and about these sorts of games in general, is they don't always involve puzzles so much, but it's sort of randomly trying every single option until you find the right one. Some of the things that you have to do in order to progress in this game are, completely rational, but others just seem sort of random, quite frankly. Of course, this criticism can be extended into contemporary Japanese adventure games. They're not so much games as, visual novels in which you have to press just buttons to sort of get to the next line of text. I won't show you the ending of this game. There is a unexpected plot twist at the end, of course. Don't want to spoil it for anyone who actually might play the game. But overall, this game is actually pretty satisfying, and I would definitely recommend it. Certainly, it's the most historically important game we're looking at this episode, and while it's maybe not quite the same level as Mario Brothers, this was a game that had a huge influence in Japan. And we're going to see a lot of detective adventure games for the Famicom. Unfortunately, most of them have not been translated into English like this one has. And this is Karateka, a port of a 1984 game originally for the Apple II. As you can see, it was designed by Jordan Mechner, the man who would later go on to develop Prince of Persia. Now, Karateka is a very unusual game. It really doesn't resemble any other game of the time. Play-wise, it's sort of a cross between a beat-em-up and a fighting game. You move from left to right, battling an endless, or seemingly endless, parade of enemies, just like a beat-em-up, but you actually fight them one-on-one, very much like a fighting game. You have health meters, and unfortunately your health meter does not get replenished after each battle. So you sort of have to conserve your health very carefully. There really aren't any healing items in this game as far as I know. And the game uses these unusual cinematic transitions between you moving forward and the enemies moving towards you. It's really quite unusual. You use the D-pad to control your stance. You have like a running stance and a fighting stance. If you're not in the fighting stance, when an enemy hits you, then it's instant death. The object of the game is to get all the way to the far right-hand side and, rescue the princess or whatever, and just basically kill off everyone who's in your way. You have both kicks and punches, but kicks are quite a bit more useful because they have a longer reach. And actually, at least on a lot of the earlier enemies, you can sort of spam them simply by kicking them over and over again. And there is also, of course, the annoying bird that tends to shave little bits and pieces off your life bar. Visually, this game is very unique. It actually uses some sort of rotoscoped type of animation. It really gives it a very interesting look because the movements are so lifelike and smooth. You perhaps really can't completely see that in this video. Like a lot of games this vintage, it is not afraid to fuck with you. For example, the gate. If you try to walk through it, it will drop down and instantly kill you. Getting through that gate is actually quite difficult and frustrating. Unfortunately, the fighting system is not very deep, and like I said, can sort of be you can sort of spam your way through a lot of enemies. That really sort of takes points off what would be a very interesting game. If only the fighting system were a little bit better, the game would be a lot better. But of course, this is very early in the fighting game genre history, so you really can't blame it for, not being Street Fighter 2 or whatever. We might categorize this game as sort of a fascinating failure. Our next game, released the same day as Karateka, is Lunar Ball, or Lunar Pool as it's known in the US. And Lunar Ball is a pool simulation game, but it's one with a difference. As you can see here, you can control which round you start at, but also you can control the friction. That is the friction of the table, which will make a pretty substantial difference in gameplay. Now, this game was released by Pony Canyon, the same folks who released the awful Onyanko Town. However, rather than using the same horrible developer who did that game, they actually used a very highly respected developer known as Compile. Folks who are fans of shoot-'em-up games will probably be familiar with the name Compile. They develop some of the most well-beloved shoot-'em-up titles for home consoles, especially for the MSX computers and for the TurboGrafx-16. They could do quality work, and it really shows in a game like this. You use your D-pad to move that little cursor around, and that'll sort of show you which direction you'll be hitting the cue ball. Just like in Nintendo's Golf, there's sort of a power meter that moves up and down. How much force you hit the cue ball with depends on how fully charged the power meter is. Now, this game starts off simple enough, but once you get into the higher levels, the pool table will start getting crazier and crazier. That and the fact that you can control the friction of the pool table really makes this a very unrealistic pool game, but it's a lot more fun because of that. The name Lunar Pool, I guess, is supposed to imply that this is how they play pool on the moon. Here's one of the later pool tables. Part of the challenge of the game is trying to figure out how to get the balls into the hole with these crazy shaped tables. In Japan, this game was released by Pony Canyon, but was also released in the US as well. Pony Canyon doesn't have any sort of US presence, so it was released by a company called FCI. This was one of the first FCI games, I believe. FCI is part of Fuji Sankai Communications Group. That's the same company that owns Pony Canyon. FCI was a company set up in 1986 to distribute Pony Canyon games in the US. They're actually still around, but they're no longer involved with video games. This is what the game looks like with the friction turned all the way down. You're playing on a super smooth surface, so your ball will go around the table forever virtually. This makes the game a lot different, needless to say. Even if you normally find pool games pretty boring, like I do, this game is actually a lot of fun, and you really ought to give it a try. It's definitely not your typical pool game. In the category of blatant rip-offs of old Atari games, we have Star Luster by Namco. This was the first Namco game to be released specifically for the Famicom. Eventually, however, Namco did release an arcade version of this that was basically one of those Nintendo versus arcade machines. After selecting your difficulty level, you'll find yourself behind the cockpit. If you've played Star Raiders, you'll know how to play this game. You look on your little interplanetary map there and find where you want to warp to. The E's mean enemies, the B means base, and little asterisks are stars, I assume. Now you have to move reasonably fast because enemies will eventually start blowing up bases and planets if you sit around not doing anything. Once you've reached your destination, you'll engage in some first-person star combat, firing off your little lasers, trying to avoid enemy fire, and once you've blown up all the enemies in this sector, you then move on to the next one. This game does have a few little features there, like there's an energy bar. Every time you fire a shot or move anywhere, you'll use up energy. If it gets too low, you'll have to go to the nearest base and refuel. There's a shield. This is sort of like a Halo-like shield, where if you take a hit, your shield will go down temporarily. And then you'll need to not be hit for a few seconds while it re-energizes itself. You also have a radar, computer, and engine status on the right-hand side of your cockpit. If you get hit, one of those may go down and you'll need to go to the base for repairs. While there really is nothing original about this game, the presentation is actually pretty good. Using the sprites to create a 3D effect is pretty effective in this game. The controls handle pretty well. And as I mentioned, this was the first game from Namco designed specifically for the Famicom. So they have now joined Taito in designing games for the system, rather than just merely porting arcade games. This is something we'll starting to be seeing more and more of in the near future. I believe the next big arcade game manufacturer to do this will be Konami. We've just docked with the base here, and this has refueled our energy and whatnot. I believe we're playing this on the easiest level, the so-called training level. The other levels are a bit more difficult. When you also have some kind of photon torpedo thing, which we're using now. If you put your cursor on a square where an enemy is and start firing off your torpedo, you will blow up all the enemies on that screen eventually. You only have a limited number. You see them like the little pink squares on the left-hand side there. Not a bad game, even though there's nothing original about it. Even one of the enemies look exactly like the Death Star from Star Wars, as you may have noticed. One funny little thing, when the game is over, it'll give you your ranking, which is usually some ridiculous little name, like in this case I am Cadet Mitochondria, meaning I didn't really do that well. Certainly worth checking out. Oh, it even has a nice little "the galaxy is destroyed" screen when you lose. Hey, you guys remember Formation Z, the horrible horizontal shooter? Well, it's back, and now it's called Volguard II. Well, Volguard II is actually really not that bad. It's actually quite a bit better than Formation Z, but it's kind of similar in that it's a horizontal shooter in which you can sort of change into some sort of robot. That was apparently quite a popular theme in Japan at this time. This game is from DB Soft, the same company that gave us Flappy, and it's actually really not that bad of a shooter. It's pretty frantic, as you can see. So frantic, in fact, that they don't give you a system where one hit kills you. You actually have a life meter, or a damage meter of some sort. In the upper right-hand corner, currently it says O2. That's how much damage you've taken. When it gets to 99, then you die. Of course, it sort of slowly builds up over the course of the game, and you can actually take quite a bit of damage if you're not careful. Now, Volguard 1 was never actually released for the Famicom. It was actually a game that came out for MSX computers. And while you might think this game looks pretty primitive, it actually sort of has some features of more advanced shooters at the time. For example, you can get power-ups, like here you have a second little ship that allows you double shot. These kind of things were actually not really common in 1985. And there are even bosses at the end of each level. For example, here comes one now. You have to blow up each individual gun turret, then you can blow up the actual city at the top there. It does put quite a few bullets on the screen at one time. When it comes right down to it, this game is actually pretty hard. You can select the level that you want to play in. Level 4 is the most difficult. In fact, it's virtually impossible. So if nothing else, it's a challenging game. As I mentioned, you can change into some sort of robot mech type creature, but it's really not that useful, as all it really does is sort of give you sort of like a larger vertical profile and you get hit more. You see the mech right here. The nice thing is you can run along the ground, you can destroy the little bases down at the bottom easier. You have to use your bombs to destroy them otherwise. So not really a bad shooter, especially compared to stuff like Formation Z, but there'll be better things coming out of the Famicom later. Now we come to one of the most hated NES games of all time, Spelunker. In Japan, this was released by Irem. If this music sounds awesome, it's because it's from Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. The actual original in-game music is really not that great. And I think we've just seen part of the reason why this game is hated so much, because you die an awful lot in this game. Now this is a port of a 1983 American computer game. I believe it was originally developed for Atari computers, ported onto many systems, including this Nintendo version, which was perhaps actually developed by Irem themselves. If so, shame on them, because this is a terrible port. I think a lot of this has to do with the controls. They're very stiff, very unresponsive, but as people have pointed out, your character can fall a very small distance before dying. I mean, if your character was a real person, this would be like a 2-foot drop killing you. It's a shame because this version of Spelunker, I mean, looks very good. It looks a lot better than the computer versions, but it's just so unplayable because of the controls. When I tried playing it, I mean, I just die over and over again. Any little tiny thing kills you, and it's, I mean, just a very poorly ported game. So this one we're going to have to say, definitely skip it. And it certainly has earned its reputation as one of the lesser games for the Famicom. So for all you fans of Formation Z and Volguard II, we have Choujikuu Yousai Macross. This is yet another horizontal shooter in which your fighter can transform into a robot. This game was developed by Namco and was sort of published in conjunction with Bandai, who I assume owned the rights to the TV series this was based on. Oddly enough, the name on the video game box actually says Namco rather than the usual Namcot. Macross was a very popular Japanese animated series in the 1980s. In the US, we know it as Robotech. Basically, it concerns humanity battling a race of evil aliens or something like that. For this game, this translates into flying to the right and blowing up every spaceship that comes your way. This game is actually very similar to Volguard II. You can change shape. The robot shape is or is vertically larger, so you have a lot more likelihood of getting hit, but it's more powerful. Basically, you fly through space, enter some sort of space station, and then blow up a little boss at the end. Then the game repeats over and over and over again. The levels are actually pretty short. This game looks better than Volguard, but I don't know that it really plays any better. In some ways, it's actually even more simplified than Volguard. There really aren't any like power-ups or anything like that. Occasionally you get like a bonus point or a bonus life or something that will refuel your power bar. You can take quite a few hits, just like in Volguard II. I personally find the space scene to be rather distracting. All those little orange explosions in the background make it kind of hard to see the enemy's fire when you're playing it, so I don't really like this game, and it is incredibly repetitive, and I find it to be a little bit on the difficult side. So as far as shooters go, this is pretty typical of a mediocre shooter of this era. Well, here's a bit of a switch up on the shooter scene for the Famicom. This is a port of Capcom's classic 1942. One thing about this game is this is in some ways maybe the first port of like a modern classic arcade game to the Famicom. Most of the other ports were either much older classics like, Pac-Man or Donkey Kong or BurgerTime or whatever, or they were ports of more recent but much lesser known games, such as Ikki, which we saw earlier in this episode. Also of note, this was the first Capcom game for the Famicom. Capcom was one of a newer generation of video game arcade game developers. They've been around since 1979 and were originally known as Capsule Computers or something along those lines. That's where the name Capcom comes from. Their first game came out in 1984, and this game, which was originally in arcades in 1984, was their first major hit. Capcom would eventually go on to overshadow a lot of the older companies like Namco and had many huge hits, both in arcades like Street Fighter II, as well as in the consoles, games like Resident Evil and Devil May Cry. They're obviously still around and still making some pretty good games. In 1942, the arcade game really injected a lot of new life into the shooter genre. Add a lot of things like, for example, the power-ups you can get. Gives you extra shots, wingmen that'll come and attach themselves to the side of your plane and also give you more firepower. Being able to explode all the enemies on the screen at one time by getting a certain power-up. There's bosses every few levels. Really, this game was pretty influential on later shooters. So it's a real classic and a lot of fun. Unfortunately, this Famicom port is definitely not as good as it could be. This was not ported by Capcom themselves, unfortunately, but rather by a rather infamous company known as Micronix. Micronix is a lot like Toza. They're one of those shadowy phantom developers that other companies use anonymously to develop games, and their games are generally noted as being pretty bad. This game has a pretty bad frame rate and is kind of jerky and not at all smooth playing. Of course, Micronix's bad conversion can't completely ruin the game. It's actually still quite a bit of fun to play, but overall it's quite a disappointment, really, compared especially to the arcade game. We're coming up to the first boss right here. Is actually quite difficult, so this is probably one of the better shooters for the Famicom so far, but certainly not as good as it could be. As I've mentioned, we're covering some rather notorious games this episode. Spelunker is considered by some to be one of the worst NES games. However, my vote for worst game this episode actually goes to a much lesser known game called Doughboy. And this game was published by Kemco. They are noted as being a manufacturer, publisher of NES games that aren't very good, and they're actually still around. They've developed for a lot of systems, but most of their games are pretty mediocre, and some of them are downright awful, like this one. As far as I can tell, your plot of this game is you're some sort of soldier trying to get to the end of the battlefield or something. You're the little guy in green there. You have a gun, but oddly enough, it's easier to kill your opponents simply by walking into them. Now these little things here, there's like things you pick up like mines and TNT and so on and so forth. You can hide in the little trenches. It's kind of hard to explain exactly how bad this game is by looking at the video. I mean, it controls horribly. The graphics are incredibly ugly. The scrolling is pretty choppy. I mean, really, I have nothing at all nice to say about this game. It's pretty unplayable. You certainly won't have a good time playing it, that's for sure. To give you an idea of some of the gameplay issues, in the second level here you have to use dynamite to blow up those little radar things in order to cross the rivers. Yes, the blue part is supposed to be water. However, you actually use the same button to switch between items in your inventory, to shoot your gun, and to set off TNT. This makes it rather difficult to set off TNT, and actually I never mastered the art of setting off TNT. I would always blow myself up whenever I tried, as we'll see in a moment here, but it seems very, very tricky to actually play this right. And I really didn't have the patience to get past the second level, and quite frankly, probably neither will you, because this game is really an enormous mess and fails in every single category. Spelunker has nice graphics, Bokosuka Wars has innovative and unique gameplay, but this game really has nothing. This next game is Galg, or Zunosinken Galg, which means something along the lines of Brain Battleship Galg. This name is given on the box art. Released by DBsoft, presumably developed by these Team Biotechers people. This appears to be a rather simple looking vertical shooter, but according to the box, it's actually an RPG, or rather an RPG shooter. Perhaps the best way I can describe this game is Tower of Druaga as a shooter. The object is to collect 100 parts. Here's one now, that little triangular thing. Once you've got all 100, you go to face the boss, whose name is Drag. There's about one part per level, so the game is quite long and quite repetitive. And just like Tower of Druaga, apparently this game is much more complicated and involved than it appears to be on the surface. As it turns out, there are numerous hidden things, various sorts of power-ups and objects, and all kinds of crazy things that you can find, but which you might not encounter during normal gameplay. There's various events you have to do that will actually trigger these things to appear. So while this game is virtually unknown in the West, in Japan apparently it's considered to be a major breakthrough title. Incredibly, there was even a game guide written and published about this in Japan, explaining how to find all the hidden secret things. If you were to sit down to play it though, it will mostly seem to be sort of like an average typical shooter of the day. In fact, a rather repetitious one. I played through I think about level 11, and the game doesn't really change that much. One interesting thing is that at the end of each level there'll be like a little split, and you can decide which path you want to go down. However, if you actually want to try to get the most out of this game and find all the hidden things, well, good luck. I don't believe that there's ever been an English language FAQ or walkthrough written for this game. As I mentioned, the game is really not at all well known in the West, so I couldn't really find out that much information about it. It's really not that hard to play. I mean, I blow myself up quite a bit in this little video I've made here, but in reality when you're playing, you'll find it more kind of boring and a test of patience rather than actually difficult. It's hard to imagine anyone wanting to play through like all 100 levels and get 100 parts to finish the game. Still, the idea of a shooter with RPG elements built in is rather intriguing. Hopefully someday someone with more patience will explore this game in a bit more detail and find out more about it. Now we come to a game that is also sometimes described as one of the worst games the Famicom ever made, Bokosuka Wars. However, rather than saying this game is bad, I'm just going to say it's slightly misunderstood. It's actually a very original, unique game. There was really nothing like it before or since. This is actually a port of a game by ASCII originally designed for the MSX. In this game, you play King Surin. The object is to march 600 meters to the left to battle Ogrith, which is some sort of evil wizard, and just turn a lot of your men into trees and imprison the rest. Throughout the game you'll bump into the trees and rocks, and if one of your comrades is imprisoned within, he'll appear after you bump it. He's then added to your army. In theory, the game is very simple. You move your character across the screen. If you happen to run into an opponent, a battle will ensue, and the winner dies. However, the method of moving your units is quite strange. You can select which kind of unit you want to move, either the king, the knights, or the pawns, or you can move them all together. However, unless the king is selected, the entire group will move together. For example, if you select your pawns and you hit up on the D-pad, all of the pawns will move one space up. You actually can't move them separately. This can make navigating pretty tricky, and it's quite easy to get one of your characters to accidentally run into an enemy or get stuck behind something. One thing that might confuse people about this game, and make it more difficult than it really is it superficially resembles an action RPG. For example, when your units battle an enemy, if they win, they'll come out a little bit stronger. Therefore, you might think that you should battle as many enemies as you can and get your units stronger and stronger. However, this is definitely not a good idea. You can only level up your units so far. I believe that winning 3 battles with the knights, for example, will level him up to a gold knight, and then he doesn't get any stronger. Once a unit dies, there's no way of reviving them. You of course always pick up more units throughout the game. For example, here we found some that were being held in prison. Use your knight to break through the walls, and then you can get the guys out. But really, your main strategy in this game should try to be to avoid all fights if at all possible. Really what you'll be using your pawns and your knights for is more or less a sort of cannon fodder trying to get the king across the screen. Because if the king gets killed, the game is over, and you have to start over from the beginning, it's best to try to avoid using the king in any battles at all, even though he's the strongest. Here we've just uncovered some sort of magician surrounded by some sort of ghost. If you kill the magician first, the ghost will disappear. You actually have to walk your king past the magician in order to get him to the walls to disappear. Now there certainly are a lot of spots where you actually cannot avoid battles at all. For example, right here you basically face a solid wall of enemy golden knights, and in order to get through them you're going to have to do some battles. Here as you see I am having to use my king to do some fighting, but really this needs to be kept at an absolute minimum. More than anything else, this is basically a strategy game. The object is to figure out how to move your pieces across the board with a minimum of fighting. If you do risk a lot of battles, and your king does get killed, you will probably eventually get the infamous "Wow, you lose" screen. Of course, folks who rush off into battle with their king, figuring he's the strongest unit, will probably see this screen quite a bit. This is because the battles seem to be determined not only just by your character's strength, but by a good amount of luck as well. While of course luck is normally used in, RPGs, in this game there seems to be about a 1 in 4 chance that a character will lose a battle, even against a much weaker character. And here is the famous "Wow, you lose" screen. You get a similar screen if you win. So if you do actually have the time and patience to make your way all the way through this game, and it can be a little bit on the long side, especially if you're constantly having to restart, you will finally come to King Ogrith. And again, winning the game is strictly a matter of pure luck. All you can really do is just keep throwing your characters into him until finally you just happen to win. In this case, when I actually use Surin to battle Ogrith, I do win, but the odds are just as well, I could have lost as well and had to start the whole game over. So you can certainly see why this game can be extremely frustrating. The fact that you can come so far, spend so much time playing it, and basically lose the game on the roll of the die does seem rather unfair and frustrating, and really, if you play this game, you'll probably get to hate it pretty quickly, simply by the way it just keeps killing you over and over and over again, and of course once you win it starts over. So my opinion on Bokosuka Wars is not that it's a terrible game, but rather it is a difficult, unfair, frustrating game, but also a game that's rather unusual, relatively well designed, and rather unique. So it's definitely worth trying, though I certainly can't say that everyone will actually have the patience to finish it. Once you know how to play the game, however, and have some basic strategy, it is actually possible to get through it. This game is known in Japan as Obake no Kyutero Wan Panic. I believe that wan is the noise that dogs make when barking in Japanese. Has a pretty good little bit of theme music here. This game is once again from Bandai, and once again probably developed by the mysterious phantom developer known as Toza. This game is based on a 60s manga and anime series, Kyutero, about a mischievous ghost that moves in with a family and has a dog phobia. We'd probably categorize this game as a side-scrolling platformer. You need to run, jump, or fly over the various obstacles, avoiding the dogs and their bark attacks. You also have a steadily diminishing power bar. You need to eat various fruit and candy in order to survive. As I mentioned, you can fly, though this uses up quite a bit of energy, and once your energy bar gets to about the halfway point, you will lose the ability to fly until you refuel again. You also have the ability to shoot out some little sort of Gao burst. Unfortunately, the range is very, very short, so it's actually really not of much use. This game doesn't really look that hard, especially if you're flying, but further into the game, the food gets much more scarce, and you'll have to do a lot of platforming rather than just flying over all the enemies. Every 3 screens or so, every 3 levels or so, you come across a boss. I think the object of this game is to find the various missing children in the neighborhood. This guy looks like he's some kind of bank robber or something. Perhaps he's kidnapped the kids, I'm not really sure. Now in the US, of course, this particular anime was not at all well known, so the game was reworked as Chubby Cherub. Graphically, very little has been changed. Obviously, your character is now a little naked cherub with a rather grotesque jaw that opens up when he eats things. A few of the icons have been changed, all the Japanese text has been removed. The US version is easier because your power bar goes down at a much slower rate. This enables you to spend a lot more time flying as opposed to running and jumping. This game has a somewhat bad reputation. Internet semi-celebrity Sean Baby put it on his list of all-time worst NES games, but it's really not that bad. It's hardly a masterpiece of the genre. It is interesting that this game came out only 2 months after Super Mario Bros. Thus, this game is actually the second side-scrolling platformer actually designed for the Famicom. Certainly worth taking a look at this game, even if the Chubby Cherub character design is a little ugly. Something rather unusual is this rather grotesque stereotype that appears in the game. I assume this was something in the Japanese version that was never changed. All in all, however, this is pretty good for a Toza game. It's definitely not the disaster that was Kinnikuman. Our last game this episode is Thexder. Now this game came out on December 19th, 1985, and the Macross game had come out on December 10th. In other words, it had been a whole 9 days since Japanese consumers had a game about a jet plane that can turn into a robot. Obviously this game existed to help fill that gap. Now you're probably thinking, oh man, not another one of these things, how many of these things do we need? Well, this is not actually quite the same as those other games. This is not really a horizontal shooter, even though it certainly looks like it when you turn it on. And you might be tempted to play it like a shooter, or that'll probably get you killed pretty quickly. This is almost more of a platform style, a run-and-gun game along the lines of, oh, I don't know, kind of looks a little bit like Metroid or something like that. It's not really a platformer, it's not a shooter. It's not a run and gun, it's some kind of weird combination of all of these. Now something I should tell you is that this game has a pretty big fan base here in the United States. This was originally released for Japanese computers. It was ported to the Famicom, of all people, by Squaresoft. This is actually the first game published by Squaresoft for the Famicom. The game was later ported to American computers such as the Apple and the Commodore, and it became quite popular and is considered to be sort of a classic of early games on American computers. However, I personally think the game is really, really terrible. In theory, this game sounds pretty cool. You control this robot who has to sort of fly, run, jump, and shoot his way through all these giant Metroid-style levels. It seems kind of ahead of its time. This is certainly a lot more interesting looking, I suppose, than all the other sort of bad shooters we've been looking at. But I really have a hard time playing this game. Maybe it has something to do with the controls. I mean, this little, when you're in the jet form, if you, the jet runs up against a wall, it'll transform into the robot. Makes it kind of difficult to navigate these narrow passages. Likewise, if you're the robot and you accidentally press down on your D-pad, you'll transform into the jet. I often find myself transforming from one form to the other accidentally. Also, I find this game to be a little on the hard side. Maybe I'm somehow not in the right mindset for playing it. I'm trying to play it like it was a different kind of game. Unlike a shooter, for example, these enemies don't die in one hit. You have to hit them a whole bunch of times. That might not be so bad, but your weapon has some sort of auto lock-on feature, where it'll sort of shoot bullets in all directions at any enemies on the screen. You can't just shoot the enemy that's coming directly towards you. It'll shoot one bullet and then shoot bullets up and down and so on and so forth. You have to do a lot of shooting and backing up, shooting and backing up. So I've certainly tried my hand at playing this game. I'm not very good at it. I really couldn't get very far. And to me this game seems like a huge mess and a huge nightmare and almost completely unplayable. But apparently it has its fans, so don't let that stop you.